zoological form of education. Taking your children and teaching your children that hierarchy, domination, and oppression are entertaining. That's really a great thing to do with your kids, you know. I mean, and so I really think that, you know, I once debated zoo people. I went to some meeting. There was some thing where the American Zoological Association was there, and I debated some person. And I done some research before I did the debate, and I found like a number of studies that show that the average person stands in front of the, you know, the information plate that they have at the exhibit for like 3.4 seconds or something like that. It's not educational. It's a form of entertainment. Not that it would be justifiable if it were a form of education, but it's not even a form of education. Sorry.
I wasn't going to do this, but this brought up something that has been on my mind. I know what I've learned so far reading your books and speaking with you and the website resources, that how we spend our time and energy as advocates, the resources, is effective. And one thing, if it's not going to be effective, and it's actually harmful for everything we've been hearing, put into single issue campaigns and welfare activities. The zoo issue I have with my local zoo where I live, they want to transfer the elephants to another zoo, and there's a sanctuary saying, no, we'll take them. Don't. So I'm looking at today how important it is to adopt and foster homeless animals.
Right.
And I look at these elephants right now in a window of time is almost being homeless, right? There's a chance that we could influence them to go to a sanctuary.
Well, I think that's fine.
Is that, I mean, I'm thinking it's a good fostering effort, not a single issue campaign. I make it clear that all the animals should go to a sanctuary, but while this opening is there.
Yeah, no, I think that's fine. I mean, look, I have 6 dogs. I mean, you know, look, as I said, actually, the thing that actually gets me most in trouble with advocates, although there's a number of things, but one of the things that gets me most in trouble is when I say that I'm opposed to domestication. As a matter of fact, there's a philosopher in Canada that's written sort of an entire book saying, you know, Francione's views on domestication is wrong. And because I take the position that domestication is a violation of rights. Domestication cannot be morally justified. And you know, as much as Anna and I love living with our dogs, if there were 2 dogs left on the planet and it were up to us as to whether or not they continue to breed so that we could have pets, the answer would be no way. We have no right to continue to breed animals. I don't care. It doesn't really matter. I mean, it doesn't matter if all the animals in the shelter disappear. So now the question is, are we going to breed some so that we can continue to live with them or not? The answer is no. We cannot justify domestication. Domestication itself raises all sorts of problems. I always say, look, let's adopt every animal we can. That's why I love having 6 dogs, but it is, you know, I was showing people some pictures of, you know, the fact that we now have 6, 5 of them sleep on the bed, and we have sort of been relegated. We're sort of like, the other night I fell out of it. I mean, you know, they're laying there, you know, they're laying there with their paws up and stuff, and you know, we're on the edge, and you know, and I said to Anna, you get on the outside. I mean, you know, it's like but you know, but I think we ought to adopt all the animals that, you know, that we can.
I really do. I am trying to learn how to make it clear in my letters, like for zoo officials and city officials that are actually able to influence this, that all animals should be released. We don't, you know, want a zoo. I'm just learning how to phrase that and word it.
That's, you know what? I'm glad you're struggling with that, because that shows that, you know, you're taking this seriously and you're trying to do advocacy in an effective way. And, you know, and I'm
read it online that someone's talking about the zoos help educate children. And said, listen, children today know more about dinosaurs than just about anything. So how did that happen?
No, what it educates children into is it educates children in the insidious idea that oppression is justifiable in a form of entertainment. I wouldn't want my kids learning that. Yes, sir.
How do you respond to people who ask you about what about animal experimentation for medical purposes for human benefit.
You know, that's the one use of animals we make that is not transparently frivolous. I don't think as a practical matter that animal experiments are for the most part efficacious. But the problem is that, you know, it's really hard to argue against that because the conventional wisdom is that, you know, animal experiments are you know, give good information that is useful. So I always basically say, look, we would learn a lot more, a lot more, if we use humans in experiments, right? Because I mean, what we're doing with animal experiments is we're always extrapolating, right? And we're always extrapolating. So it would be much better if we used humans in experiments. And the response is always, yeah, but we can't do that. Well, it's illegal. Well, if it wasn't illegal, would you be in favor? Well, no. Well, why not? What if we used it? You know, is it well? It's all right to use animals because animals aren't like humans. They're not rational. They're not, you know, they're not able to. Okay, fine. So there are human beings that aren't rational. Matter of fact, we had one as president for 8 years. You know, there are human beings that aren't rational. Would it be all right to use them in experiments? And you know what's really interesting is most people, when they're confronted with that question, will say, you know, well, no, actually, not only is it not acceptable to use somebody who's mentally disabled in an experiment, but many of us feel that we have a greater obligation to people who are mentally disabled because they are more vulnerable. And so that we believe that actually our moral duties increase in terms of our obligations to the vulnerable. So once you get somebody to say, oh, that would be horrible to use mentally disabled humans in experiments, then you say, well, then why is it all right to use the vulnerable non-human in an experiment? Because you think that somehow their inability to think rationally in the way that we think. I believe animals think rationally. I mean, they certainly behave in ways where it's impossible to conclude other than the fact that they behave rationally. But, you know, I mean, they don't speak, so we don't know exactly how they think. But assuming for argument purposes that they are not able to reason, so what? We don't ever think it's all right to use humans who can't reason in experiments. So basically, you end up in that situation in making the argument called the argument for marginal cases. The argument that most of us accept it would be immoral to use marginal humans in situations like that. How are non-humans any different? And the answer is they're only different because of species, but that's like saying they're different for reasons of race or sex or sexual orientation or preference.
I would argue that. I would argue your position, and the position I would use is that the animal experiments are biased by their very nature and not useful for medicine or anything else because they do not apply directly to the human physiology.
Right. There's always Eric. There's always this guy. This guy keeps my dogs alive. He has formulated the evolution dog food, and I know some of you were horrified. My dogs inhale his kibble. They just love his kibble. And I know some of you were horrified yesterday, but read the ingredients. They're wonderful because I mentioned that I tried them on a salad I had instead of croutons. I just wanted to see what they taste like. They're really delicious. But Eric, I agree with you completely. I don't think they're efficacious because they require extrapolation. And once you really understand how the experiments work, you see how actually inelegant they are in terms of those extrapolations. It's very crude stuff. It's very imprecise stuff. And the idea that we trust our health to those experiments is beyond ridiculous. But the problem is, Eric, because the biomedical establishment has done such a tremendous job of brainwashing people, you know, you end up getting involved in what we call technically in the law a pissing contest about whether or not experiments are efficacious. I would rather sort of get to the moral point. I will talk about the efficacy point, and I have some examples that I use about how, you know, using for example, testing a product for cancer, you can get different results if it's done through inhalation or through injection, and things like that. The number of variables is just remarkably high. And the conclusion that animal experimentation is not efficacious, I think is one that is compelled by anybody who understands how those experiments work. The problem is most people don't really understand how those experiments work. And so, you know, you've got a choice when you're talking to a person where you've got maybe, you know, a limited amount of time with them. Am I going to focus on the efficacy question, or am I going to try to get to the moral question? But I agree with you.
Well, I think if you focus on the ethical question,
Yeah.
there is a perspective from a scientific view that they are unethical experiments because they do not apply to human physiology. And so that a lot of these experiments are construed by animals with different genetic structures than the human being. So developing the lethal dose 50, for example, killing half the animals with lethal doses of a certain experimental drug is totally unnecessary and expensive and doesn't really help to develop a useful drug for human use. And as we see with so many of these drugs that have been formed by using animal experimentation, but also using human experiments and studies as well, there's questionable advantages to using the animals at all. Why not just, you know, but you can pay humans to be subjects in experiments, and they do that routinely.
I think one thing I think we have to be really careful about that, though, because I don't like the idea that people who have poor people basically will. I mean, I don't like the idea of saying that informed consent is satisfied because someone volunteers for an experiment, because lots of times the people who volunteer for the experiments are really economically disadvantaged. And I think, you know, and also, you know, I remember once being at an animal rights conference, everybody thought we should be using prisoners. I said, wait. You know, however much you may object to when people who are in prison are done, let's not sort of get a movement around the idea, and let's experiment on prisoners, because that raises a whole other set of ethical issues. But I hear what you're saying. One thing I wanted to say about single-issue campaigns, what I've always found interesting is the longest running single-issue campaign in the history of the animal movement is the anti-vivisection. I mean, that was really the first single-issue campaign in the 19th century. Think about how illogical that is. If people are willing to eat animals and make themselves ill and get all sorts of diseases that they get from eating animal products, are they likely to see it as ethically impermissible to kill a few more to, quote, cure them? Whether or not that's going to work. But, you know, and I remember there was a vivisector from UCLA. His name was Dario Ringash. And some of you may be familiar with him. He's quite a character. And he contacted me a couple of years ago, and he said, I want to come to Rutgers and debate you. And I said, fine. Now, what are you doing next Tuesday night? And so he came to Rutgers, and we had a room that held about 100 people. We ended up getting about 300 people. And the first question I asked was, how many of you all are vegan? And a small number of hands went up. There were a lot of people who were opposed to vivisection, but there were very few vegans. And I said, this is going to be a sort of surreal night for all of us, because if y'all are willing to consume animal products that are clogging your arteries, giving you cancer, and killing you, then you're not going to really see a very significant problem with the fact that he wants to kill some so that he can, quote, cure you of the illnesses that you have unnecessarily gotten as a result of animal exploitation. So if you think about it, again, to use a technical expression, it's sort of ass backward to sort of focus on vivisection. When, you know, that's why I think veganism and creative, nonviolent vegan education is the way to go. It answers all problems. Once you get people to see it, then everything else becomes clear. Until you get people to see it, they wander around in confusion. This is not rocket science. It's really quite simple.
I had a couple of things to add about zoos and vivisection. The earlier question about zoos reminded me of what Gary has said in the past about endangered species treaties. Into every endangered species treaties are clauses saying that as soon as the species are no longer endangered, as they move from one category in the treaty to another and they're less endangered, then it's all right to exploit those species again and kill them supposedly in a sustainable way. So the sort of using zoos to breed those species feeds into that same system. They'll breed them up to a certain extent, but then after that, they won't be endangered anymore, and then they'll be killed sustainably. It's not the individual rights that matter, it's the species as a whole. So I don't agree with that. The best way to protect endangered species is to protect their habitat, which is endangered. So you can find a good one, an organization that buys up land to protect habitat. The other thing, as Gary has said, is to go vegan and to promote veganism. That will, stop global warming and stop all of these species from going endangered in the first place. The other question about vivisection, Gary and others have used this analogy where a lot of the roads in the southern United States were built by slaves. Those same roads are maintained by prison labor. We're opposed to slavery, we're opposed to prison labor, but we still drive on those roads. We're going to campaign as hard as we can to stop prison labor, but it doesn't mean we're going to not drive on those roads. So similarly, if you're going to die unless you take a medication that has been tested on animals, I might take it, but still campaign against vivisection and for veganism.
Why not call it civil rights for animals?
Basic rights.
What's wrong
Well,
with
I
that?
call it basic rights, fundamental rights. I mean, civil rights, I don't really see animals as part
It's a
of our
metaphor.
society. I actually, in my ideal world, there are no domesticated animals. There are only animals living in the wild. We shouldn't be living with animals. There's something terribly wrong about domestication. As much as I love my animals, they are totally controlled by me. They are dependent on me for when they eat, when they sleep, when they go out, and they have the hope that I, remember to do everything I'm supposed to do. They exist in another world of vulnerability. They are not animals because they're not capable of taking care of themselves, and they're not human. It's really unfair what we do to them. Domestication, in my judgment, is obscenely immoral. Having said that, there are animals in existence, and I don't believe we have a right to kill them. And I think we should give them good homes. I think we should take care of them. But I think we really need to stop producing them. So therefore, I don't really talk about civil rights because I don't really see this as a matter of rights for them to enter civil society. I see this as a matter of basic rights, the basic right for them not to be treated as property. And frankly, once we recognize that, domesticated animals will cease to exist, which is the situation, in my judgment, that should exist. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. One of the things that I've taught for a long time with regard to animal experimentation is that there's a lot of evidence out there that it's actually totally ineffective on humans. What they're done is actually done on the animals.
Right.
Instead of the animals. And if we have the diseases, we should be the ones stepping up to that experimentation. We're the ones who want the solution. We should volunteer as the disease holder to go through the experimentation process. That, to me, seems like the appropriate ethical response on that particular matter. And there's a lot of diseases that are not caused by our own types of behaviors. There's a lot of different cancers. I think we should be careful with the kinds of things that we accuse people of being the only, reason
Well,
for their disease.
look, I'm not a physician. I'm actually one of the, I would defer to Michael on that. Michael Packer, whom I've known for 30 years, to call him a pioneer would be a hyperbolic understatement. He told me yesterday that he now lives in California. Those of you who live anywhere in California, Oregon, or Washington should take advantage. I mean, he's one of the finest physicians. And he is really a pioneer, one of the original people, and one of the smartest people I know in this area. So, Michael, why don't you address that? I mean, are our diseases mostly a function of what we eat?
Oh, the vast majority are, no question about that, yes.
But there's many that aren't.
There are some that
There
are.
are some that are infectious diseases, maybe.
Well, there's infectious diseases. There's very rare cancers that we don't know the cause of. There's there's people who went and got nursing in their 4th stage and died anyway. I mean, there's a lot of examples of people who are dying of diseases.
I have no problem if somebody has a stage 4 or if somebody has cancer and wants to volunteer because the treatments, the accidental treatments will not work, and they want to volunteer to do, I have no problem with that. I am very, very concerned about human experimentation because I'm very concerned about vulnerable populations, particularly poor people, being at risk. You know, and we do that. There's a certain amount. I mean, you know, drug companies do a certain amount of that testing in third world countries, and you know, and I find that really objectionable and horrible. And I think it should be illegal under U.S. law. But
the people who have the disease and want the cure should be the people who will
okay,
step up and take it.
okay, that's fine. I hear you. I hear you. Hey.
I have two things. One, in response to your question about the obscure diseases, even if you could make a case for that, no drug company would ever do a study because there's no economic return on such a small population. I just don't see that as something that would ever happen, in my opinion. But on a completely different note, I have a science background, and I was veganish for years because of environmental reasons.
Did you say veganish?
Veganish.
Veganish. Okay.
Since I was vegan, I became aware of people like Chris Hedges, who wrote Saving the Planet One Meal at a Time, and Dr. Oppenheimer, who wrote Comfortably Unaware. Do you think that there is a place at all interlacing the environmental issues and people like that who are vegan, who do promote veganism from an environmental standpoint, or does it just confuse the issue from an ethical perspective?
Look, that's a great question, Peg. I think that, I mean, I talk about the ethical issue, but I talk about the ethical issue as one of nonviolence. And then I talk about nonviolence to other animals, to oneself, because I think we have an obligation of care to ourselves. And I think we have an obligation to be nonviolent to the environment on which all sentient beings depend. And so I will talk about the environment. I will talk about the environmental issue. But I think it's a mistake if people are vegan for environmental reasons. Then I've never met anyone who is anything more than veganish for environmental reasons. And you know, because I mean, if that's your real primary motivation. So what I try to do is persuade people that that the real issue here is nonviolence, but that nonviolence is not just a matter of what you do to animals, it's what you do to yourself, and it's what you do to the planet on which all sentient beings depend. Then, you know, I think that helps to make it sort of more holistic and link up the animal moral issue with the duties to self and the duties to the environment as the thing which sustains all sentient beings. I should say, I don't know Oberlander personally. I know Chris Hedges personally. As a matter of fact, the night that I got into a car accident, which is responsible for my headache, I was on my way to Princeton. Anna and I were going to Princeton because we were doing an event with Chris and with his partner Eunice. We were doing something at Princeton on veganism. And Chris is concerned about the environmental issue, but Chris has actually now become very, very concerned about the moral issue. And he actually made an interesting comment to me. He said that he had covered the Bosnian War, which he said was a very brutal war. And he said he felt one of the reasons why it was so brutal was because many of the young men on all sides of that conflict had been raised on farms where they were dismembering animals quite frequently. And he said it was a very bloody thing because people were using machetes and hacking each other apart. He said all wars are terrible, but Bosnia was really, really brutal. And he thought it was because of the farm culture, which he thought was pretty brutal, that translated to what was going on, in the combat. And so I think Chris is, again, I wouldn't want to speak for him. He's a very eloquent speaker, but it is my impression from talking to Chris that although he is concerned about the environmental issue, and I don't know if you know Chris Hedges, but he's just a brilliant progressive thinker who is concerned about issues of war and issues of exploitation and the problems of capitalism. And Chris is very concerned about the moral issue because I think he's made the link that nonviolence has got to include non-humans for all sorts of reasons, both for humans and for the non-humans and for humans, because of what it does to us. It is corrosive. You know, we can talk all we want about whether animal products are harmful to our body. I believe the empirical evidence is overwhelming that they are. And I hope I don't want to offend anybody who who finds such talk offensive, but it seems to me that animal products, whether there's a doubt about whether they're bad for our bodies, I don't believe there is. There is no doubt that they're bad for our spirits. They're corrosive of our spirits. Because what we're doing is we're ingesting, vitamins into our bodies. And I just can't understand how that could ever be anything positive. I just can't. It just boggles my mind. You know? And so I always say, I'm now working very hard with the Jain community in North America because Jains are vegetarians. They're all vegetarians, but they're not vegans. And we had a video that unfortunately we just couldn't get to work. We interviewed Chitrabhanu, who's a former monk who lives in New York. He's a former Jain monk. He's 90 some odd years old. He's a remarkable guy, a really remarkable guy. And we did a clip of him to bring to the conference. It just didn't work. But the Jain community is in transition right now. And one of the things we talk about, they keep inviting me to their conferences, and I keep, beating them over the head with, if you believe in ahimsa, you got to go vegan, and they just keep inviting me back. So I just keep on inviting me back, and so I take it that they agree with me, but it's a cultural thing. Jainism grew up in India, surrounded by Hindu culture, which places milk and dairy, milk and ghee in a primary position, and so it's a cultural thing. But I think we're making headway with the Jain community. As a matter of fact, I'd like to say that before I leave the planet, I think there's a very good chance that we will get the Jains, particularly in North America. I don't know about the Jains in India, but the Jains in North America, I think we will get them to be a largely vegan spiritual tradition, which would be terrific if we could do it. But we're making progress. Anybody else? Is there anybody who has? Yeah.
They can replace the ghee with coconut oil.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of things they can replace it with. And it was interesting, there was a Jain meeting in London, and what they did was, Chitrabhanu was invited, and he would not go unless it was all vegan, but he didn't want them to announce that it was going to be vegan. So they ate for several days, and everybody thought the food was great. Then at the end, Chitrabhanu got up and said, it was vegan, and nobody said, oh no, and they said, no, I thought it was ghee. Because you don't need that. There's nothing you can't, that you can't do with soy products or plant products.
You can make the best kitcheni with coconut oil as ghee.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true.
Better than Ayurveda.
I'm sure it's true. He's sure it's true too. He's sure it's true. Does anybody have any questions about particular arguments you get hit with that you find difficult to deal with? Like people come up to you and ask you something you don't know how to answer it. What is it? We can deal with anything. Yeah.
Well, I remember when I very first went vegan, the first thing that the first person I talked to said was a couple things. The classic, why do you like animals, care about animals more than humans? But then also she kind of implied that there's only a limited amount of time and that we should be putting our energy into helping humans as opposed to helping animals.
You know what? If somebody says to me, I want to spend my time helping humans, my view is, God bless you, do it. But you gotta eat 3 times a day. Eat vegan. Gotta buy shoes. Don't buy leather. Gotta buy clothes. Don't wear wool. And so I'm not interested in dissuading anybody from doing human rights work. Animals are exploited terribly, and the numbers are not comparable to humans simply because there are more animals on the planet. But the sorts of things that happen to humans, is just dreadful. What happened? How many children will go blind today because they don't have like, 6 cents worth of vitamin A. How many people would die as a result of, of illnesses that could easily been prevented? And so, how many women get raped? In America, if you make, by the time a woman makes it to age 22, 25% of the women who make it to age 22 have either been raped or attempted to have been raped. So that's what you know. So can you imagine? It's probably like worse than that. So like that's a hideously serious problem. The violence against women is a very, very serious problem. And so, I'm all in favor of people working on those things. I mean, absolutely. I think that that's great. I wish more people would work on those things. But when they do that stuff, they got to eat, they got to have clothes on, and they got to have shoes on. So like, fine, keep doing your work. Let's fight for the revolution. But while we're doing it, let's be vegan. While we're doing it, let's wear non-leather shoes. While we're doing it, let's not wear wool. And so, it's not an either-or situation. And also, there's limited time and resources. And the one thing that is clear, we're all going to die, and we all have limited resources. And so the question is how best effectively to use your time. And I think that it's clear to me that if your issue is, you want to focus on the animal issue, there is no more effective use of your time than creative, nonviolent vegan advocacy. It's what we need right now. It's what you don't need anything other than your will to do it. All you need is your will. You make the decision. You're going to do it. Do it. End the story. You can do it. You can do it. All of you can do it. Yeah, Daphne.
Hi, so I have a big one because some of you might not have heard the one but God says, when we can eat meat. It's from Gary Yerusharoff, or how do you pronounce it? Yeah, him. He says, it's that quote about, well, I'm paraphrasing, but, if you think that, this God has given you the right to slit the throats of animals, pulling the babies away from them, raping the females and probing them with some whatever, electron, whatever, then what the fuck does the devil do?
Right. Well, that's one way to put it.
And I used that on a woman at one of the Floyd Roth protests, and she was really heated, debating, and so that's the thing that actually finally made her go, oh, because she was a French chef, and she was saying that, God provided the animals, but that's the thing that finally just shut her up, and it stumped her. She's like, yeah.
Well, I mean, look, as far as Grofsky's concerned, unfortunately, Gary's got a lot of good ideas, but Gary also promotes violence and says things like, he thinks that every woman who wears a fur coat should be raped, and
No, I know.
I find that unfortunate. I find that objectionable, and I find that really objectionable. But I think, and I don't know that I would necessarily. Look, I always say, if you've got a God who condones violence, then you need to get a different God, because that God is not a particularly good one. But also, I do think it's more complicated than that, in the sense that all religious traditions, in all religious traditions, there are elements of violence. There's no doubt about it. The Old Testament is a tremendously violent doctrine. People always say, well, Quran, is a terribly violent book. Anybody who says Quran's a terribly violent book and doesn't think that the Old Testament is terribly violent hasn't read it. But if you read the Old Testament, as I said yesterday, if you read Genesis, in the first creation story is quite clear. Everybody's vegan. Everybody's vegan. Animals are vegan. Humans are vegan. Because the herb and the seed, it shall be your food. It's only after the covenant is ruptured and humans are ejected from Eden that killing begins. And when the covenant is restored, then all of the prophets see the visions of peace and coexistence. And so, so I think that we really need to sort of focus, even if somebody thinks that those things are divinely inspired or whatever. The documents themselves are sufficiently ambiguous to, in my judgment, make it clear that veganism is the position when humans are in a state of grace, or whatever one wants to call that, with God or Yahweh or whatever. When one is in the state of grace, one is a vegan. And so why do we want to wallow around in a non-state of grace? If what we aspire to is a state of grace, why don't we do that? And so, you know, I mean, I think there are things one can say to religious people. Having said that, I think with some, you know, with some religious people, you just get to a point where, you know, they believe that their religion has justified a very, very, you know, strong and severe and harmful form of speciesism. And, you know, you may not be able to make much progress. On the other hand, some of the best advocates I've known in the 33 years I've been doing this have been people who are religious. I mean, you know, there have been religious Christians, religious Jews. They have been awesome. And you know, and so I think that, you know, I'm always I think it's not. I think a lot of animal people are anti-religion, and that troubles me. A lot of these people are into Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens. And I think that those people are reactionary. I think their views, I think Sam Harris is frightening. It disturbs me that a lot of my students read Sam Harris because I think his idea that you can use science to show that Islam is a bad religion or whatever. I mean, you know, I think he's Islamophobic. I think they are. I think, you know, I think all of the new atheists, Dawkins, Hitchens, and Harris, are basically people who are very reactionary political views and are promoting the idea that Western civilization needs to be spread all over the place because it's the superior civilization. And I think that's exactly what the New World Order wants. You know, that's why they're popular in a lot of ways, because they articulate justification for the New World Order. So those of you who are into those people, you should take a step back and sort of realize what those folks are doing. And I think it's really, really harmful. I think Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins are tremendously dangerous people, and not dangerous because they have good ideas, but dangerous because they're promoting a right-wing agenda. Yes, my friend from Latvia.
Yes, I still have a question about Islam. I read the Quran recently, and I have a problem with the text that it's written how to beat your wife, when and which is the right way. And I'm not an atheist, and I don't talk about religions, that is good or bad, but I have a problem with, for example, with this issue in Quran.
Yeah, but religion, look, women don't do well. Women don't do well in the Old Testament either. You know,
it's not better. It's not with the Old Testament, of course, also.
I'm sorry?
There are problems.
Oh yeah, look, you know, the one thing that all these religious documents have in common is they're all written by men, for the most part, right? And, you know, and they're all written by supposedly divinely inspired men. And you know, I think it was Andrea Dworkin, who was a terrific woman. She's passed away now, but she was a terrific person. Andrea Dworkin was a radical feminist. She was wonderful. And I think it was Andrea who said, once you have a concept of God and you call him he, it's all downhill from there. You know, so I don't disagree with you. I'm not. All I'm saying is that I think we should be careful, you know, to deny that there is something of a spiritual element involved with that. I mean, I was thinking that yesterday as I was watching Sue do her presentation, because I could almost feel, literally feel, palpably, a sort of a spiritual power in that art. You know, it wasn't just, those aren't just pictures. Those aren't just drawings or whatever artists call those things in form. It's almost sort of a spiritual, it draws you in spiritually, I think. And I just think we ought not to be afraid of using terms like spiritual. And talking about, every time I post something, every time I post you know, I have this thing saying, you know, animal products are corrosive of our spirit or something like that, you know, and I post it now and then. And I always get people saying, why do you have to get into religion? And the answer is, that's the way I feel. I feel that this is on some level, it's a spiritual matter. On some level, my belief that ahimsa is the ultimate metaphysical truth is to some degree rational, but to some degree it is a spiritual belief. You know, and I'm not ashamed of that. Yes.
This is a particularly condescending one I've gotten to start this compliment.
Yes.
people have said in correspondence online, oh, Amanda, it's so great that you have a lifestyle that you can afford to have your organic eating diet. But who are you as the great white savior to go to other countries and have these long-running cultural traditions, and they're relying on the farm animal, and that's what they have. And, you know, who are you to tell, or the poor people of the United States who don't have as much access as you? Isn't it sort of imperial of you to tell these people what to do? I don't know.
When they ask you that question, just say, no. No, I'm okay.
Just being accused of elitism.
Elitism, yeah. There is nothing more illegal. Nothing more illegal than the idea that it is all right to kill another sentient being, take life from another sentient being because you like the taste. There is nothing more elite, more hierarchical, more I think we have to be careful to not promote the idea. Look, a lot of the prepared foods that you go to buy at Whole Foods, which have a lot of salt and virtually no nutritive value, a lot of that processed stuff is very expensive. You know, bowl burgers and tofurkey and stuff. And I don't eat that stuff. I don't eat fake meat because I don't like to be reminded that for the first 25 years of my life, I ate that stuff. So I'm not really interested in, you know, somebody says, oh, it tastes just like meat, try it. I say, no, I don't want something which tastes just like meat. So I don't eat fake meat. If y'all want to eat that stuff, that's fine. I don't. But I think it is expensive. And I never tell people that, you know, fruits, vegetables, beans, grains, seeds. That's what you need. And that's cheap. That's absolutely cheap. And, you know, and so the idea that, you know, you're telling people, oh, well, you know, I want you to adopt a lifestyle that's going to cost you more. The answer is, if we, and one of the things that, you know, that I'm working on with some of my students now is we're trying to address issues of food deserts, because I work in a food desert where people can't get fresh food and they can't get decent food at a reasonable price. So what we're trying to do is to say, you know, let's work with, because folks in Newark who have no money, it's not that these, you know, these quarter pounders or half pounders or 5 pounders or whatever these things that these sandwiches are that these folks buy, that they're cheap. They're like $5, $6. They're expensive things. For $5 or $6, they could get, if they could find it, they could get a bag of rice or other grain and some beans, and they could get some seasoning, and they could have a much healthier meal. The problem is they don't have access to that because we don't care about people of color and poor people, so we make sure that there are all sorts of fast food places, liquor stores, and places where people can buy cigarettes. And which is why, you know, the lifespan of an African American in many of our urban areas in this country is lower than the lifespan of people in some third world countries that are even more, you know, that are very, very, very poor, which you think, oh, well, you know, it's really horrible. They die younger. They die younger here. And so, you know, these issues are all intertwined. These issues of animal rights and human rights, these are all intertwined. And this idea that, you know, that veganism is elitism is nonsense. Yes, if you're telling people, you know, you should go buy tofurkey and you should, you know, buy organic this or organic that. No, what you're telling them is eat fruits, vegetables, beans, grains, nuts. You can get that, you can get those things just about anywhere unless you live in a food desert. And a diet of those products is always cheaper than a diet that includes, always cheaper than a diet that includes animal foods.
Well, I've responded with the 3-word answer, beans and rice before, and then after that always follows that poor people have to work jobs so they don't have time to cook the beans and rice. And then you say,
I love white middle class stereotypes about what poor people do. I just love them. They're endlessly entertaining. Endlessly entertaining. Well, let me see. Yeah, Vonna.
Yeah.